Welcome back to Close Read. This is Aaron Huertas, and I'm excited to talk to Dr. Gretchen Goldman today. Gretchen and I worked together for a long time at the Union of Concerned Scientists, and I wanted to bring Gretchen on because her expertise is in scientific integrity and censorship. So as we have these discussions about free speech and open debate and who gets a platform to speak, I wanted to bring in some really substantive, important, extremely serious, high-impact policy issues, including ones we're seeing right now with COVID. Hey, Gretchen.
Hi, Aaron. Thanks for having me.
Great. So before we get into it, could you just talk a little bit about your academic background and the work you do at UCS?
Sure. So I am the research director in the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists. But before that, I got my PhD in environmental engineering. I was studying air pollution and health effects. And the science was really interesting. I really enjoyed the scientific problem I was working on. But the more I learned about it, the more it became clear to me that a lot of the bigger challenges in that area weren't so much scientific problems we had to solve, but policy ones. And how do we get the political will and societal change we need to listen to the science, to follow the science, and help people? So that led me to look into ways I could uh, do a career that was communicating science, that was doing policy advocacy and analysis, and trying to be at that intersection between science and society. So that led me to the Union of Concerned Scientists, where I've been doing work for 8 years now on these issues, on science and democracy, and how our government, especially at the federal level, uses and misuses science, and what we can do about that.
Great. And, one of the things I've been thinking about as I've followed the news coming out of the CDC and the NIH is how important these scientific integrity policies are that we worked on. So I wonder if you could talk about those a little bit. And these are policies at federal agencies that do science.
Yeah, so the scientific integrity federal infrastructure is an evolving thing. So it started essentially in under the George W. Bush administration. We started seeing a lot of places where science was being misused or manipulated or suppressed. And this was happening across the government. It was things you might assume, like climate science, but also some other ideological and financial pressures that led them to sideline science on a range of things, from endangered species to drug policies. And there wasn't a lot that federal agencies at the time had to push back on that with. There wasn't a lot of scientific integrity policies around, or ways of places that scientists and other federal staff could go if they wanted to do something about that challenge. And so the Union of Concerned Scientists and others called for the federal government to address that in a bigger way. And then under the Obama administration, we saw a lot of progress on that. There was a directive from President Obama that agencies should develop scientific integrity policies. So by the end of the Obama administration, we had 28 agencies that had scientific integrity policies. And they were varying degrees of comprehensiveness. But importantly, there was a lot more in terms of official policy that would protect science and protect scientists. And it gave them some ways that they could move forward in either in reporting allegations and trying to prevent different kinds of interference in science. And so we were in a much better place going into the Trump administration. And those policies are all still in place under the Trump administration. And some of them have been really effectively used to push back on a lot of the science interference cases that we've seen in the last 3 years. But we clearly still have a long way to go. And there's a lot more that we need to do to protect federal science, as we'll talk about here.
Yeah, the work continues, but it is good to see some of those changes over time and some of those protections actually, get solidified and be useful. And as we talk about COVID, this is obviously a really high stakes debate. And as we get into it too, I guess I would want to establish that political interference in science is a really big category, and censorship is one one way that political appointees and politicians interfere with science. But before we get into the censorship issues, could you talk about some of the other forms of political interference that happen in these policy areas?
There's several ways that interference in science has happened. Under the Bush era, for example, we saw a lot of direct manipulation. So, literally striking the word climate change from scientific documents. There was another case where they literally changed the numbers about how established endangered species was in order to avoid having to put in place federal protections for that species. And so that's sort of a direct interference, sort of meddling in scientific input. It's usually a non-scientist that is editing the scientific content of an official document. And then there's also ways it happens where it is just suppressed or
Mm.
delayed indefinitely if it is inconvenient science. So a good example of that is that the EPA under Trump a few years ago, there was a scientific assessment, a chemical assessment on PFAS chemicals, and we discovered in a FOIA response, a Freedom of Information Act response, that they said, well, we're not going to release that because it would be a PR nightmare. So they essentially,
You don't say.
said the quiet part out loud, which, of course, release of that email made it, in fact, a PR nightmare for them. Uh, so that was one where, they did the report. The report itself was not edited, but they had no intention of releasing it, even though there was no scientific or process reason why you wouldn't have released it. So there's also that kind. There's a lot of ways that scientists themselves have been targeted. So this can be retaliating against a scientist for speaking out about something, or from refusing to concede on changing scientific data. Often there's a lot of historically, there's been a lot of cases of that where scientists are reprimanded or reassigned or
Mm.
removed from projects, or even transferred offices if they do something that is politically inconvenient. So those are some of the major categories of the kinds of things that we see. But in general, the kinds of things we're looking for are any time that science isn't effectively able to inform the process of at agencies or in decision making in the government. And that's not to say that every decision needs to be based on science. There's, of course, many reasons we might choose a policy that have nothing to do with science. But the science that informs those decisions should be able to reach decision makers. It should be independent. There shouldn't be any inappropriate interference.
Yeah, and we throw the phrase "listen to the science" around a lot, and or we believe in science. I often hear that, and when you get down to the level of the laws and the statutes, the way science is treated varies quite a bit. I think we've often pointed to the Endangered Species Act as a law where you have to follow the science pretty rigidly, but other laws might give policymakers more leeways in making recommendations or bring in cost benefit analysis or whatever. So if you're the policymaker who's looking to interfere with science, sometimes you have more of an incentive to go after the science if what you're really after is your specific policy outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. Science is very vulnerable to interference because it is so powerful legally and as a political talking point.
Yeah, and it's interesting. People always want to be the ones who say that they have science on their side, even if their side is doing this very undermining stuff. And I think what you laid out there, there's active censorship, the red pen, getting scrawled across the scientific report, but then there's all these passive forms of censorship, ignoring something, letting something go very quietly and not bringing any public attention to it, or hoping the public doesn't pay attention to it. And you also talked about reassignment and this political pressure on individuals. And all this adds up to what people sometimes call a chilling effect. And I wonder if you could talk more about those chilling effects and how they affect communications and even what we research.
Absolutely. There's a lot that would fall into the category of things that provide create a chilling effect for scientists working in the government. We've seen a lot of that can be examples that people have seen of science or scientists that have been sidelined. Under the Trump administration, I think it's been especially problematic because of the way the president has acted on science and the degree to which people and ideas and concepts have been targeted on Twitter and just a tweet. And I think a lot of scientists will see that and know that it is possible that they could be in the next tweet or their issue could be in the next tweet. And there is such a fear of there being retaliation or funding cuts for their science, and because we've seen sort of this instability and a sort of lack of support for the federal scientific enterprise by this administration in general, a lot of scientists see that and think about that, and so there's a lot of interest in not ruffling feathers, trying to keep your head down and doing work. And so in the way that plays out is that a lot of scientists, even if a political appointee didn't directly tell them not to talk about something, not to work on a topic, if that topic is politically contentious, many in the government will just choose not to work on it or downplay that work or not talk about it. And we actually measured this on a survey in 2018 where we asked scientists across the government if they had been directly if they'd been directly told not to work on politically contentious topics, and then separately if they had not been told but still were choosing not to work on topics such as climate change because it was politically contentious. And we got back several hundred scientists across agencies who said, I was not directly told this, but I've been avoiding it because of fear of retaliation. And so that's very concerning to me because I think we are seeing this chilling effect across the government. And I think I would just add that, it is reasonable that there would be different emphasis points and different ways of focusing on topics when you have different administrations in power. And if you are in power, it is their right to say, we'd like to focus on this topic. We are very interested in this kind of framing, but that shouldn't come at the expense of science communication. It shouldn't mean censorship of specific words or topics or anything, but that is in fact what we're seeing. And so, I often think about it as, well, maybe in a narrow context, it makes sense you'd want to refocus things. Maybe you wouldn't talk about a contentious topic in this specific memo. But, if we wake up after the end of the Trump administration and there's then not a single reference to climate change anywhere on federal websites, that would be a huge problem. And that would be a huge disservice to the public who should be able to rely on the federal government to provide accurate and timely scientific information.
Yeah, and we've both worked with whistleblowers, with scientists who faced interference, who are working at government agencies who reach out for help, and I have so much empathy for them because this is not what they signed up for, right? To fight political interference in their work. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how those individual scientists respond. You touched on self-censorship a little bit, and ways that people keep their heads down and avoid this sort of conflict. But once that conflict happens, what are some of your options when you've got a political appointee, breathing down your neck, maybe threatening you with getting reassigned or losing your job or just making your life difficult? What can you do?
Luckily, there's lots of avenues that scientists have now for what to do when they experience these kinds of things. Unlike the Bush era when there really wasn't a lot there and technology and media interest in this was very different, now there's lots of ways we can respond. I think the vast majority of these instances we don't even hear about as the public because they are resolved from within. So on that 2018 survey, we scientists provided really high marks for I have a supervisor that stands behind me on controversial decisions. So that was really good to see. It seemed like most federal scientists had a supervisor or manager that would back them up, that would carry forward their scientific opinion, even if it was something politically unpopular. So
And let me just ask a clarifying question there. Most of the time, is your manager at a federal agency also a career appointee or a scientist, or do you mean manager in the context of a political appointee, or the political appointee is a couple layers up?
Sure. Usually, for the vast majority of the scientists answering the survey, their supervisor would be another career official.
Right.
Whether that person is also a scientist would vary. I think it wouldn't always be another scientist, but for most people, it wouldn't be the political level. So I think when you get to that level, so if you have a political appointee that is attempting to interfere with your science or threatening you. Other options people have, if they do not have a supervisor who would be sympathetic to helping them address that, there is now scientific integrity officers and ways of reporting, or even before reporting officially, you can discuss it with your scientific integrity officer. And so there's a lot of problems I think that happen at that level too that we just don't hear about, because they will talk with their scientific integrity officer, they will work it out, they will figure out how to address any conflict or potential differing opinion. If that could become an official violation, so if you file a allegation under the scientific integrity policy, that'll be investigated by the scientific integrity officer. And so that provides some recourse for you. I think it is not risk-free as far as your job and your sort of personal livelihood of the agency being affected, but that's an option you have, depending on the level at which it is. We at the Union of Concerned Scientists sometimes have confidential conversations with federal scientists about how to deal with an issue and help them think through, what to do about it. Scientists have the ability to leak things, of course. There's ways to get anonymous documents out. And so depending on the situation, that's been an option for people if they don't, if they just want to get a big media response in order to force action, or force the political officials to back down from whatever they're doing. And we've seen that effectively used a few times in this administration. And that one, the scientist doesn't have to give up their identity. Usually they can leak things anonymously, or you can, have other ways of doing it so that you're kept confidential. And there's also, of course, legal action.
Yeah, and actually, let me just pause a second to plug how to securely share information about scientific integrity abuses on the Union of Concerned Scientists website. And I see that protectscientists@protonmail.com is a great secure email to send anything to if you're looking to leak some information, if you're facing some political interference in your work.
That's right.
Okay, good. Yeah, and then beyond that, we've had some scientists who've, they've spoken out, they've exposed things, they've wound up testifying before Congress, they've done lawsuits. What are some of these examples where things get really escalated? What are someone's options if they really do want to pick that fight?
Yeah, we've seen a few who have, bravely took a stand. So there's you can publicly resign. So some people have done that. They've said, I'm unwilling to do that in this capacity. And some have done that in really strategic ways of either, working with the media so that you can get a lot of attention to it when you do that. So Joel Clement, who now works with us, but came from the Department of Interior. He did this fairly effectively, and this was one of the first scientists that came out from the Trump administration saying, my science has been sidelined, and that got a lot of media attention. He had a Washington Post piece about it, and so he was really effectively able to use that to tell the bigger story of what was happening under the Trump administration and why it was bad for the government's ability to use science to do its jobs. So that's been a really effective way to do it. There's several scientists who have quit or were forced out that are now involved in taking legal action. So there's whistleblower complaints that can be made. And so, in some cases that may make sense for people that have been feel they were wronged and have that. So we also at the Union of Concerned Scientists can connect you with legal support if there's scientists or other federal employees that want to have a consultation and figure out if that makes sense for them. So yeah, there's several paths that people have taken. I think there's a lot of options now to get the word out or decide what to do if you are asked to do something that you don't feel is aligned with your scientific integrity.
So now I want to get into what's been going on for the past several months with COVID, and you've studied this closely and have done some really interesting research on it for the Union of Concerned Scientists, and I was able to read through that. And one thing that I think was very interesting that you laid out was past pandemic responses and sort of the normal way of doing things versus what we're seeing now. So in a world with functional government and with policymakers who are aligned with the scientists and with the agencies, what does a sort of pandemic response look like? What sort of messages does the public get, and what do people see from our science agencies? And also feel free to establish what some of these agencies are. You mentioned 28 agencies earlier. I think we often don't appreciate the alphabet soup of federal agencies that are out there and all the work they do until a crisis happens. But there's obviously a lot of agencies involved in this response too.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people at those agencies who have probably their whole lives been training for this moment in the pandemic, and it's frustrating to see them not be given that chance to the full effect. But so first, I would say, a global pandemic is an exceptional situation. So, anything that's an emergency situation, anytime there's, something new that requires a lot of government coordination and has a lot of scientific questions around it, there's going to be some chaos. There's going to be some evolving understanding of the issue. And so I think, there would be, even in a world where we had a very functional leadership in this country that was willing to and wanted to listen to the science and scientists, there'd still be some level of evolving messages and some missteps as we, as a society, try to figure out what to do about this evolving situation. So I think we would have seen some of that anyway, just because this is, a hard stuff that we're dealing with. And that said, though, we can look at past epidemics that have happened and compare the response and the degree to which scientists were able to be the communicators on those. And if we do that, we see a stark difference between how COVID-19 is being handled and how past epidemics were handled. We're seeing that there's been far less CDC press briefings. So in past outbreaks, the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which studies disease in our country, so this is filled with many scientists who think about these issues all the time and work on different aspects of pandemic response and communications and vaccine development and all the logistics that need to go into fighting this and understanding what's happening. And so, for example, under the SARS outbreak, which happened during the Bush era, CDC did 100% of the press events. So there was never a presidential briefing. They had 18 briefings and they all came from the CDC. And then when you look at H1N1 under Obama, we saw they had 35 press events, but the vast majority of those were at the CDC, and only a handful were done by President Obama. And yet, under the Trump administration, we saw the overwhelming amount of communication has come from the White House, and there's been very little press events or anything out of CDC. In fact, the CDC briefings that have happened on COVID are on par with the number that happened for SARS. And as a reminder for people, SARS had 8 cases in the U.S. There were 8
Jeez.
people with SARS, and that we had just as much CDC communications on that as we have for COVID, which of course is now affecting hundreds of thousands of people every day.
Yeah, and for the public health professionals, that's strategic. You don't want the head of a political party, the president, out there being your main spokesperson on a pandemic response or an epidemic response, because that is going to provoke polarized reactions for people who have strong political opinions about that leader. And I've read that was a deliberate strategy within the Obama administration for their response too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's many reasons you'd want the scientists out front. I mean, first, just logistically, like they have the most facts; they're able to answer the
Right.
questions, and there's that. There's lots of research about scientists being more trusted messengers than others on things, and yeah, as we'll talk about, I mean, it eliminates any political filter. It allows scientists to say what they know to be true from looking at the science, and that eliminates any opportunity for suppression or altering of the message from the scientists. And as we've seen, it's not a lack of availability, right? We have really skilled science communicators on this that are knowledgeable on this, and Fauci has a tremendous fan base now, and so it's not that we don't have anyone prepared to do this, because we clearly do.
Yeah, and I guess before we get to Fauci, two other things I wanted to touch on were just, if you're the CDC or another one of these agencies, you can't just load up your best scientific advice on your website and hit publish. You actually have to go through a clearance process with the White House, right?
Yeah, there's been a lot of problematic influence of the White House at CDC. And actually, so interestingly, on our 2018 survey, we asked what are the biggest barriers to science-based decisions at your agency, and we listed out a whole bunch of things, and you could also fill something in. And the only agency that said the White House as their top answer was the CDC. And at the time, this was sort of this bizarre result that we didn't know what to make of, because it wasn't, there wasn't too much in the public realm that was sort of suggesting that. But now under COVID, we see how clearly that is true. They have to review things. We just had this incident where data now that is being bypassed around the CDC, and they're not even able to handle the data that comes in on COVID deaths and capacity. And so, it's this huge problem now that we see the White House is really stepping in and taking over control of a lot of what should be in CDC's territory.
And then each of the agencies, or I shouldn't say each one, but a lot of the agencies have media policies. And I noted with interest that the CDC's media policies seem to not be on their website anymore.
Yeah, this is a big problem. We noticed that the CDC media policy is gone from their public website. And so media policies clarify how agency staff can and cannot communicate with the media. They are very important because it shows scientists what their rights are in terms of being able to speak to the media. And this is important because we see a lot of federal scientists are hesitant to talk to journalists, especially because of the self-censorship issues and fear of retaliation that we discussed. And so often they need things really set in writing. And a lot of the policies are very good in that they do allow scientists to talk to the media without having to get it cleared by a political official or public affairs at their agency. But we need scientists to be able to know that. And one way they know that is if there's a public policy that they can look up, or a journalist can remind them of, that tells them about it. But the CDC has taken theirs down, so it's not even public. Our understanding is that it is on the intranet of the CDC, and so staff
Huh.
still has access to it. But it's sort of not the time that we should be removing public policies from agency websites.
Yeah, censoring your own media policy has as a it's a bit of very bad poetry to it. It's not great. It's very anti-transparency. Uh,
Yeah.
so so I wanted to touch on Dr. Fauci now. He's not at the CDC, he's at NIH. Could you just say a little bit more about who he is and what his expertise is and why he's often the face that we think of when we think about pandemic and epidemic response?
Right. Yeah. He's become this new celebrity scientist in this, which uh,
He's been cool in our world like for a while though. Like I've often heard people hold him up as a really great communicator in this space because he's been at this for decades.
right. Yeah. He's had incredible experience. His scientific record is tremendous. So it's not even that he's just good on the policy, but we see he's actually tremendously accomplished in the scientific realm even recently. So he's very prepared to do this. He's been at this a long time. He's in a very high place within NIH, and so he's able to speak with this authority and this platform that allows him to be more truthful, to say a little more than we've seen some others close to the administration be able to do or be willing to do. And so it's been very effective to have him be able to talk. He has done a fair amount of media interviews, but we're seeing news more and more come out to say ways that he's been sidelined. And there's evidence now he's being actively discredited by uh, the White House. And there had been some reports of him being prevented from doing media on this. And it's pretty problematic because this is a time when we really need that scientific spokesperson, and we need consistent, reliable access to them as this situation evolves and more information becomes available. But we're seeing, and I've been impressed with his willingness to go against the whatever might be politically more convenient for him to say in different settings. But I think he is under a lot of pressure and is trying to do what he can.
Yeah, and I wanted to bring in this interview that he did with Science Magazine, and this was closer to the start of the pandemic. So this is when the Trump administration was doing these White House briefings that'll last for hours that Trump would dominate. And this was after Fauci had that moment where Trump said something inaccurate, and Fauci just put his hand on his head and kind of looked down. And people took that to mean like, oh my God, this guy's dying inside because the president is saying wildly inaccurate stuff. And he did this interview with Science Magazine, and my read of it was, how do I speak to my fellow scientists to explain the position that I'm in? Because scientists obviously care a ton about what other scientists think and their credibility in that field. That's like priority one. And a lot of people are saying, well, why doesn't Fauci speak up and say the president is wrong more? And why doesn't he do this? Why doesn't he do that? And this interview is interesting, and I just want to read a few quotes from him here. I'm trying my best. I cannot do the impossible. And then he addresses the reporter at one point. What do you want me to do? I mean, seriously, John, let's get real. What do you want me to do? And then he says, I can't jump in front of the microphone and push him down. Okay, he said it. Let's try and get it corrected for the next time. Close quotes. And I thought that was really good because we are talking about the president of the United States here. You're not really in a position where you can elbow the guy out. Like the Secret Service might have some thoughts about that. You can't. If he's the president. You can't contradict him in the moment, but maybe you have some influence in a meeting afterwards, or you can make it clear to the aides that he should stop saying whatever inaccurate thing he just said. But I'd love to get your reaction to that because it just strikes me as such a wildly hard position to be in.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. And I saw that. I appreciated his honesty about that situation because I think it is very hard. And I'm glad that he feels comfortable at least pushing back to the degree that he can. And I think that's something too that in general, as you said, scientists really care about their reputation and their how that is viewed from the scientific community. And by and large, that is what keeps everyone honest and going. And what propels science, right? That's sort of the principle behind peer
Hmm.
review, and the idea that we all have this commitment to the truth, and no one wants to be viewed as not being credible scientifically. And so that what has sort of kept people in line, and kept a lot of and forced some scientists to quit over some political interference issues. But I think too, one thing that this administration has sort of blown up around that is that up until now, I'd say in general, scientists are fairly uh, safe in terms of their jobs and being able to continue saying things and doing things, even if it is politically inconvenient for the people in power. But under the Trump administration, it's not really clear that anyone is safe, right? I mean, they've
Hmm.
done a ton of firings, and done a lot of things that are outside of norms of conduct for how you handle science and inconvenient science. And so I think that probably is, affecting some how the calculation of how people are thinking, do I stand up and put my neck out there on this, or do I stay quiet and find some other way of getting around there? So I think it is we're seeing sort of different kinds of dynamics with that. But and yeah, I think we should note that Fauci is in a comparative position of power. So he has, I mean, now he has a lot of public support, and he's high up in the government, and so he, I would hope, is fairly safe from being suddenly fired. Although probably wouldn't put all my eggs in that basket, just given this administration's record. And I think we should think about the many, many scientists in the government who also are doing important work that contributes around COVID, that might be facing the same sort of political pressures, but aren't necessarily in a position where they can push back and know that their job and their messages are safe. And I think we can assume that's happening at lots of places across the government. And there's a lot of people who are also being put in tough positions and forced to make hard decisions. And that may or may not be having an effect on our ability as the public to know the truth, know what's happening, know all about all the risks, know about any misuse of the science that's happening. And so I think we need to keep pushing and think about how to ensure we get the truth out.
Yeah, and I wanted to touch on another way that censorship plays out now in a modern media environment, and this is, there's an old Steve Bannon quote about how the way you deal with media coverage you don't like is you flood the zone with expletive, with BS, and that's a modern way of thinking about censorship. Like the good information might get out there, but I can get out 8 different versions of bad information and sort of keep everybody distracted. And just this past week, there's this really remarkable op-ed by a White House staffer, Peter Navarro, attacking Fauci. And he was able to publish this in USA Today. It's really weird. It's hard for me to think of anything like this at this level. And Fauci, to your point, he's an open book about this stuff in a lot of ways. He did an interview with 2 writers at The Atlantic. And here's what he said. He said he talked to White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, and he summarized his views to Meadows. Quote, "I said that was not a particularly good thing to do. Ultimately, it hurts the president to do that. When the staff lets out something like that and the entire scientific and press community push back on it, it ultimately hurts the president. And I don't really want to hurt the president, but that's what's happening. I told him I thought it was a big mistake. That doesn't serve any purpose for what we're trying to do." Close quotes. Wow, right? Like I can't even imagine being in that position, but he's explaining to the White House Chief of Staff why attacking him is bad, right?
Right. It's incredible that that he's being put in that place.
Yeah, and the White House had been circulating some information about Fauci. White House reporters were posting about it and writing up news stories and tweeting about it, and it just seemed one of like those classic things where it's like, well, it's obvious, they're trying to sideline this guy, and to your point, they can't sideline him. There's a lot of other people who've gone a lot more quietly because they know if they get fired, it's not necessarily going to be national news. So he's got a big burden And he's bearing it in an interesting way that I think opens up the playbook on this stuff in a way that I've not seen in a while. So before we wrap up, you started to touch on some of the misinformation that's out there, and I wanted to ask you, from an individual level, if people in my community are getting bad information about COVID, given this lack of a coherent response at the state and federal level, what I can do. And then I also wanted to ask you about, for the folks listening, how they can support the sort of systemic reforms that make this stuff easier long term. So from that individual level, could you tackle that first?
Sure. So we released last week a COVID-19 disinformation fighting product. So it's on our website, and that is has a few more resources about what you can do about the misinformation that we're now seeing on COVID. I don't expect that to go away anytime soon, and there's many reasons to believe it'll get worse once we are talking about vaccines more and other
Right.
elements. I am very concerned about this misinformation environment that we are in now. The first thing that we need to try to do is get out ahead of it. So anytime that things can be, we can get the truth out before there's rampant misinformation, that is helpful. Obviously, that's not going to be the case in this current environment always. And so, given that, I think we need to think about how do you instead just try to fight it. And so, there's a lot of science around the inoculation method, which independent from vaccines and
Right.
inoculation in that context, the idea is that if you give people first what the truth is and do that instead of repeating the disinformation, then that helps prevent people, and it makes them more likely to reject the misinformation when they hear it. So we can do a lot of that. We can try to not to try to explain the truth and get out in front on the truth when we're talking to our friends and family and coworkers. Anything from trusted sources, remind people what are trusted sources and how
Hmm.
do I spot them. And so there's a lot of information on that. And there's, of course, many trusted sources on this. We've been talking about the CDC and NIH, but also the World Health Organization, several universities and scientific societies like the American Public Health Association, Johns Hopkins, FDA has a lot of content. So there's lots of different sites that do that. Your health departments in states, for example, and so making sure that we go back to those sources, and then. We also have a lot of, if you are looking at a source of information, be it a web page, a blog, a tweet, a meme, how do you think about whether or not that is true, and things that you should be asking yourself about its credibility. And so depending on what that is, you should question it, and where does this come from? Does it play into things I already think? Does it sort of validate opinions I already have? Is it trying to appeal to my emotions? Do they cite anything? Is there anything that should make me question whether or not this is a factual thing? And a lot of it is a lot of misinformation we see, right? If you start to ask those questions, you can fairly quickly say, get to a point where it is clear this might not be the best source of information. And so I think the top thing, of course, is to not share it when you see misinformation or anything that has a questionable source, and then also trying to fight it. And there's
Hmm.
of course many things on social media now. We're seeing there could be of course a whole separate conversation about social media misinformation and what we do about that. But at the individual level, you can report things, you can not share it, you can react to people who have shared it and explain the truth, so at least things don't go unanswered. Because I think of it as the bigger problem is if things go unanswered. And when there is a lack of leadership, a
Right.
lack of communication of what the facts are, that opens a big door for misinformation. And when we have, this environment where it is people that are desperate for information on this because there's conflicting messages and a lack of clear guidance on a lot of these things about how to keep people safe. That makes people much more vulnerable to misinformation, and so that's what we need to counter.
Now, how about the systemic reforms too? And I mean, people talk a lot about the social media companies just simply having moderators and doing a better job with this stuff. But there's also government responses too. There's scientific integrity legislation. There's things the agencies could be doing. What can people and organizations do to push for more protection for the scientists who are out there doing this work?
Yeah, there's a lot more we can be doing than we are. There's the Scientific Integrity Act has been proposed in Congress. This would address some of these issues and at least require more consistent protections for scientists and their ability to communicate to the public. We can get all the agencies on the same page on this. We can have policies that are very clear in writing what scientists can and can't do, and that clarifying that they can talk to the public, talk to the media, share on social media, and do all these things. And those things need to be combined with leadership that is supportive of those ideas, because we found that scientists are going to be cautious. That's their nature in a lot of ways, and federal scientists in that environment are especially very cognizant of not sticking their neck out too far. And so, the more times we can have heads of agencies, heads of public affairs, scientific integrity officers, saying this is a thing you can do, and we encourage you to share your scientific knowledge with the world in these ways, that will help many of them to feel like they can do that without worrying about career or political consequences for doing so. So I think we need to change the agency culture at places so that they can do that, change the policies so that's clear in writing that they can do that. And I think the rest of us can facilitate that as well by pushing for that. The journalistic societies have also worked on this as well, and trying to ensure that agencies can talk with them and know they can talk with them. So I think we can do a lot to make sure that people do feel free to share their science. And it's such a the other way I think about it is that on the flip side, it's this huge loss of opportunity if we don't have a system that allows our top experts to talk to us, right? If we have the world's experts on all kinds of topics working for the federal government, and if they aren't able to or don't feel like they can inform policy decisions, go to local meetings, talk with students, use social media, that's just a huge disservice to the world of missing out on a lot of their expertise that they could be sharing with us and helping shape a variety of things that we're doing. And so I think we need to work on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's hard to think of an example of this work where the stakes aren't higher. We've always talked about the human toll that this sort of political interference in science has, because these are really important laws. It's not just endangered species, it's clean air, it's clean water, it's stuff that really affects people's lives. And it's just, it's hit you over the head, so obvious, if folks are getting sick because there's political interference in science. So I wanted to ask one more question before we wrapped up, and I told folks a little bit more about how to follow you and stay plugged into UCS. But this just feels like such a worst case scenario for political interference in science. And you've been working on this for 8 years. You're an expert. You're a scientist. All the substance aside, and all the the rational thinking we have about this stuff aside, like, how does this make you feel right now? How are you doing looking at this horrible worst case scenario with COVID?
Yeah, it's a good question. It is. So when it all first started happening, a small part of me was actually it was satisfying to see that people will get it now, right? That it's much more clear
Mm.
why all of this matters and why care about uh, wonky scientific integrity policies, because it matters to public health and safety. And that's never been more clear than it is in this environment where we're seeing the exact consequences of censoring and interfering with
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It kind
government
of sells
science.
itself now, huh?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't. It's not. yeah, it's not an "I told you so" situation, but I was just very glad that at least it is maybe more clear why all of this matters. But I think after that, I mean, I just feel so frustrated and angry um, at the situation because it's just such a loss. It's just such a waste of what we have, right? We have this incredible federal science enterprise that's big and well resourced and has tons of experts who have for decades been studying these problems and thinking about it, and we're just not allowing them to do their job. And I'm just infinitely frustrated by that situation, and like I just feel like we need to just address that because I like so sort of another example that also gave me this sort of visceral reaction was on uh, Sharpiegate fiasco, where we saw the president taking a Sharpie to a weather map, which that was sort of par for the course, and I didn't have a strong reaction to that. But then when the leadership of NOAA backed the president and threw under the bus the meteorologist who had sent a tweet countering the president's misinformation, so sharing truthful information about whether Alabama would be hit by the storm. And like that memo, I just lost it. Like it was just so the idea that leadership at an agency is not going to back their own scientists. And I just thought about when I was a meteorology student studying in
Right.
undergrad. And it is just, all you want is to accurately communicate weather risk. And I just thought that's who's sitting behind the desk in Alabama, in Birmingham, right there. It's just people that just their only goal is to communicate weather risk, and they're being just attacked, and it's for no reason. This is all for trivial political purposes, and it's going to cost lives. It's going to devastate, morale and enthusiasm for working for the federal government as a scientist, which is in the long term going to be really damaging to our ability to fight all kinds of big problems, from pandemics to weather risk to climate change to anything else. So
Well,
frustrated is the answer.
yeah, I mean, you said it, and I share your frustration. I share your anger. And I guess to your point, I also it's sort of like, okay, like welcome to the scientific integrity party. Everybody who cares about this now, like we're veterans of these fights. And I do think there are a lot more people who want to help now and who get this. So I want to leave folks with two resources. One is to just follow Gretchen on Twitter. She's at GretchenTG for tons of great information about scientific integrity. And then also Union of Concerned Scientists. It's at ucsusa.org. Union of Concerned Scientists has been around for decades, very well respected nonprofit group that does great work on science advocacy and on scientific integrity and democracy. So definitely check them out. Sign up. You don't have to be a scientist to join. If you are a scientist, you can also join UCS's Science Network, and they're always looking for stuff to give people to do on the ground to help out. Whether or not you're just a person who cares about science and is passionate about it, or someone who has a PhD and has some expertise and wants to bring that to bear on public policy. So Gretchen, thanks so much for taking the time with me today. And again, thank you for your work. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Aaron.